Hello, everybody, and welcome to Adam Ruins Everything, the podcast. I am your host, Adam Conover. This is the podcast version of my TV show, Adam Ruins Everything, which, to remind you, airs on True TV. We're currently in the off-season, but we're going to have new episodes coming to you sometime this summer. In the meantime, you can find clips and full episodes at truetv.com/Adam Ruins Everything and the Watch True TV app. Sometimes people say, why doesn't True TV have an app? And guess what? They have one. It's called the Watch True TV app, and you can find it if you search on your store, on your app store, for Watch True TV app. Have I explained enough about the app? Let's move on. We're all bored of talking about the app. Adam, we want to talk about the show. Here's how the show works. On our TV show, I interview experts for 2 minutes, 1 minute, 30 seconds, 5 seconds. Only sometimes just for a little millisecond, they'll appear for like a frame and then disappear, like a subliminal message. Like you're like, I get the sense I saw an expert, but I didn't actually see what. I just have an expert sort of feeling because you just had a moment of. Just kidding. Subliminal messages are a myth. They don't really work. I don't think. I'm not sure. I'm not up on the research. Guys, I got to be very specific because I do a research-based show and I can't get any bad information out there. So you know what? I'm not going to commit myself to subliminal messages. Maybe we'll do that later on Adam Ruins Everything, the TV show. But once again, this is the podcast. And on this podcast, instead of talking to the experts for just a frame of video, I talk to them for a long time, for 45 minutes, sometimes even an hour. We talk to them and we learn about all the incredible work that they do. Today's guest, if you saw our internet episode, which personally is one of my favorite episodes that we have ever done, you will have seen her. Her name is Susan Crawford. She is a professor at Harvard and is an expert in the field of America's internet infrastructure and why it is not as good as we would want it to be and what we can do to make it better. We did a whole segment on, our internet is not nearly as fast as we think it should be. It's many, many times slower than other countries, South Korea, many, many other countries across the world. And the reason is because of these huge cable conglomerates that have been able to merge and, join up with each other and have carved out areas of the country to make sure they don't have to compete. And that's why your internet is so slow and expensive. And, we sort of lay out, here's how we got to today in the episode, right? What Susan talks about so wonderfully is what we can do about this, how we can dig ourselves out of the hole, and what are the steps we need to take as a nation, nay, not just a nation, but on a city or local level, what we can do to address this problem. She talks about this issue so brilliantly, and she is joining us via internet telephone from New York. And by the way, she has a wonderful speaking voice, so we're all going to enjoy that together in the upcoming interview. Let's with no further ado, let's just get right into it. Take it away, me. Hello, Susan. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Hey, Adam. Thanks for having me.
Well, first of all, how do you describe your field and what you cover overall?
In the broadest sense, I'm a technological humanist. I'm really interested in the potential of high-speed internet access to make people's lives better. And I'm really worried about what's happening in the United States, that we're leaving so many people behind and we're being charged so much, and the whole economy is being drained by the actions of a few companies that have enormous power. So my field these days is the use of fiber and data to make people's lives better.
Got it. And I've noticed that you're really one of those experts who, when our research team was like, oh, we got Susan Crawford. She is the person on this. Like, I read, there was something in just reading the LA Times had a story about, the new FCC chairman's plan to do XYZ, and you're quoted in it, you're that. But then, I know you're also, you got started as a lawyer, a professor at Harvard University. How did you sort of move from A to B? How did you come to this?
I've quit a lot of jobs, Adam, and it all seems to work out. No, seriously, my background is as a musician, actually, and I went to grad school as a violist. And then I really needed to support myself, so I went off to law school where I could spend 3 more years in the undergraduate orchestra. I had a lot of student debt after that, so I went to a big law firm and I became a partner in that very fancy Washington law firm. And then life is short, so I quit that job and became a professor. About the same time, I joined the board of ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I know ICANN.
Exactly. And so I met a lot of the engineers that thought up the idea of the internet, which is the biggest idea of my adult life.
Yeah, ICANN is one of those groups that's like, they're sort of like the original they're like one of these groups you never really hear about, but they're sort of involved in like designing the very deep international infrastructure of the internet, right?
It's really the plumbing, the mapping between the numbers that are attached to your machines and
Yes.
names that we give them. And that's what ICANN is responsible for coordinating. But you're right, it's the petri dish. It's the only thing we have for anything that could be anywhere close to governance of the internet, because it shouldn't be governed, essentially, what we do on the internet. From there, though, I got really interested in internet access, which is a whole separate issue. The pipes and the wires and the very, frankly, physical stuff that goes into allowing each one of us to be online. And that's where I've been focusing for the last, 10 years or so. From being a professor, I got launched into the Obama administration at the very beginning, 2009. And I put myself in charge of a program that was giving out $7 billion to people around the country to build fiber networks. And I learned a ton in that job. I got very interested in the role of Comcast. When I left the administration, I wrote a book about Comcast called Captive Audience. And all the interviews for that book had to be done off the record, so I learned a ton about that and the power of the cable industry. I then got really interested in cities and what they can do with data, and I co-authored a book called The Responsive City. Now, what I'm doing is working on a third book called Fiber about the scrappy communities across the United States who are taking their destinies into their own hands when it comes to internet access. So I've been traveling a bit over these last couple months in particular, talking to Americans about this. And I'm still a professor. I'm a professor at Harvard Law School, and I have wonderful students there.
And in your spare time, you're just teaching classes and grading papers, I guess.
Yes, that's right. And it's a joy. My students are remarkable. And they're the ones that are going to go into local government, into the places where they're from, and lead us all out of this morass that we're in as a nation.
Right. So how would you describe this morass? On our show, we, sort of phrase it as, our internet access, despite the fact that we sort of imagine that we're leading the world technologically. We're by no means, the world's leaders. And, the story we tell is the story of cable companies swallowing each other up and sort of colluding, not to use a quasi-legal term, but, dividing up the country in order to, not have to compete with each other. And that's why we have this sort of shitty situation today where, everyone knows the cable company is this shitty company that overcharges you and they don't have to show up when they say they do because they don't really give a shit because where else are you going to go? Everyone's experienced that. And we were sort of explaining that through that sort of process of slow monopolization. But I know that, I'm sure you have a broader view of it. How do you characterize where we're at with this issue?
Well, what you said is exactly right, but it leads to this really fundamental point that the entire nation needs an upgrade to fiber optic communications between us and our neighborhoods. And I'd love to talk about fiber. I've been out to Corning to understand how it's made. It's basically magical. You can carry unlimited amounts of data symmetrically, both ways, upload and download. And because of the policies that we've put in place over the last 10 years or so, nobody has an incentive to upgrade to fiber because, as you say, the cable guys have locked up the urban areas. They've abandoned rural areas or left them to telcos that are basically moving everybody over to wireless. And the whole situation is without a plan for an upgrade. So what I'm looking into is what these scrappy communities are doing to build what is in essence kind of a street grid of fiber, reaching every house and business that then allows for a ton of competition on top of that. So imagine the street grid allows for lots of cars. They can all use that. Right. Same thing here. If you had a basic network of glass, this fiber optic cable running under the streets, you could have 15 different competitors available to you every time you flip open your laptop, certainly in an urban area. And even in rural areas, there could be competition for your subscription, and prices would go through the floor, which would be great for America. And we'd finally be up with the Northern European nations and Asian countries that figured this out 20 years ago.
So those are cities in America that currently have or are building a fiber optic grid, like just sort of, hey, we're running wires, on a municipal level to every house in town, and then different providers can, lease out those wires and compete?
That's the ideal model. That's the way telecommunications has always worked, because it just doesn't make sense to have two wires to every house because the upfront costs of building those things are so high. So the way to do it is to put a basic, really great future-proof wire in place, and that's fiber optic, and then let anybody else compete on top of it. So yes, in fact, just last week, I'm on an advisory board to the city of San Francisco, which is looking at exactly that model because, they're the leading tech city in the country, and yet their internet access is expensive and not available everywhere, and a lot of people are left out. So they're the first major American city to look into changing that situation. And I'm hopeful that others will follow suit. There are already a bunch of mid-sized and tiny cities that do this, but San Francisco is the first big leader.
Wow, this really comes back to a recurring theme of this podcast and the show, which is like America's cities as a laboratory for moving the country forward. When our federal government and often state government seem so paralyzed, it's often the cities who are saying, well, we're just going to build it ourselves.
I have to say, I have found optimism and cheeriness and can-do-ism on these trips to cities. No one ever mentions Mr. Trump. It doesn't matter, really, what he's up to. For the moment. Now, eventually, these cities will all get their act together, and that will be a patchwork of networks across the United States. It will make sense for the federal government to wake up at some point and show leadership to ensure that every corner of the country gets this kind of connectivity. Because what we do then is create a giant middle class, what we're always hoping for, a giant market for goods and services of American companies. And the best part is we create not only economic growth, but also social justice for every American. What's basic? Everybody should have the opportunity to make the most of their lives. And that's what this informational grid will give us.
And I want to be clear, what you're describing, this informational grid, this is very similar to what we currently have for utilities like electricity, water, and traditional telephone lines, correct?
I'd say this is the fourth on the list. You have water, sewer, energy, and fiber. And they actually are part of an interconnected need for infrastructure that can serve all of those needs. We can talk about that if you'd like. That's sort of an idea of sustainable infrastructure that it knows what it's doing, like how much water are we using, how much energy are we using. All of that requires fiber too. But yes, it's just a utility. It's you can do it through providing what some people call dark air, which is conduit everywhere in a city that's available for glass to go through, or by actually calling for the construction of glass everywhere. So it's a utility.
Glass meaning, is that how you describe fiber, glass?
Yeah, that's the nickname for it. Adam, it's the most remarkable stuff. I watched it being made. What happens is that it's not like you grind up sand and create fiber optic. The people who make this stuff print every layer of a thin glass tube so precisely that light can pass through it without interruption or degradation over tens of kilometers.
Wow.
It's amazing. So that technology people call it glass in a kind of a friendly way, but it's unlike any glass you've ever seen. It's so pure and so carefully engineered that it can carry, as far as we know, unlimited amounts of information based on just the electronics that are attached to it. So once the glass is in the ground, it can be upgraded without digging up the street. You just attach different lasers to the endpoints, and you can send a ton of information that way.
Oh, wow, because it's not even, correct me if I'm wrong, it's not even carrying a current. It's just light is being passed down it.
Well, I have to say, Adam, it all gets very mystical. There's not that much difference between light and energy at the edges. But yes, that's right. These are photons, and they're being sent by lasers at a gazillion times a second. And that because there's so much that can be packed onto those light beams, it can carry basically unlimited amounts of information. And it can carry it at the speed of light for great distances without being amplified. It's amazing.
So so that's why you describe it as future-proof, because it has a bandwidth that if we were to start using it now, it has a bandwidth that's much higher than anything we would use it for.
That's certainly true, and it's future-proof because the glass itself, the physical medium, doesn't need to be upgraded in order for the amount of data it carries to be raised by changing out those lasers at the endpoints. That's what's so amazing. And we think it's going to last for 30, 40 years.
Wow. And so what we have in the ground now is coaxial cable, right, or copper cable?
That's right. There is a lot of fiber between cities already. What doesn't exist is the part between, in the bottleneck part of the network, between, let's say, a network node and your home or your business. And that's because it is in the interest of the cable actors. They're not malign, they're not evil. It's just they built a network that is optimized for entertainment, for watching things, for consuming.
Right.
And it was built that way, and most of their pipe is dedicated to their channels and their way of mixing up those channels. They could also use fiber as the medium across which they deliver paid television to us. Here's the problem. They would have to compete with other providers of signals to our houses if they were just one of many actors going across that glass between a neighborhood node and your house. Does that make sense?
Why would that be if they were the ones, of Cablevision, or I guess Cablevision doesn't exist anymore, but that's what I grew up with on Long Island.
They still exist. They're hanging on. They're hanging on.
Oh yeah, they're Optimum now. That's what they are. If they if they're the ones digging the fiber optic cable and laying it out, why would they have to compete with other providers over a cable that they laid?
Oh, thank you so much for asking that question. At the moment, the cable actors have no particular incentive to replace their second-class wire, which is very much privileging downloads over uploads. They have no incentive to replace that with fiber because they're under no pressure from either competition nor oversight. So their wire stays in place unless a city does something about this and says, in addition to the cable wire, we're going to make sure that every home and business has, in a sense, a public option available to it, which is this glass tube, the fiber optic tube. And the cable actors then could choose to be one of many retail providers over that fiber, over that glass. That's available to them, and they would save a bunch of money in some ways by being a retail provider using that wholesale infrastructure. Their problem is that this would undermine their ability to raise prices and, ask us for ever more money for these inextricable bundles of programming and data access.
Right, there'd be more competition on that wire, and I think that's so interesting. I never thought of the fact that look, I've been a really heavy internet user since. Honestly, my memory of getting on the internet was that the cable company called my family and was like, "We're rolling out cable internet, and we want to know if you want to be early adopters on Long Island in 1996 or something like that." And my parents were like, "Yeah, sure." And then for some reason, the cable internet went directly to my bedroom, and then I was just on the internet like constantly. I had no social life. I was just that was my whole world. So I got an early education on some of these issues through reading some early internet activism sites and things like that. So I've known through my whole life that downloading is faster than uploading on the cable internet that we have. If you use just when I used to update my own website and trying to download one of my videos was a lot faster than trying to upload it. That uploading would take 10 times as long, and I never put it together that the reason was that this is a system that's optimized to deliver ESPN and the Disney Channel, not to share information bidirectionally.
Exactly. It was built that way, it was intended that way. And there is no reason, for example, why a fiber network would ever have to be asymmetrical in that way. Because everybody's download is someone else's upload. And if you think about needing to be working from home, accessing your doctor, taking a class, genuinely taking a class remotely, not just being a passive participant, but really being in the classroom, all of that is only possible with a symmetric connection where you're able to upload without even thinking about how much data you're uploading, as well as download. And it's that big shift that the United States has to make, because right now we have no inkling of what might be possible with the grit and ingenuity of Americans who were able to develop new uses for internet access, because they're all stuck with just entertaining themselves or tweeting, which takes very little bandwidth. So what I'm looking forward to is the creation of a tremendous sandbox for playful Americans from every corner, because good ideas come from everywhere, not just from big cities, who are able to develop new uses for a network that allows for things like eye contact, compassion, empathy, connection, real healthcare. and advanced energy. All of that is only possible with fiber.
So let me ask, you said that the cable companies are not being pressured by either oversight or competition. So the, sort of free market argument is always that, well, hey, competition is going to create innovation and is going to cure the ills of any market. And I think it seems to me that the telecommunications industry is an example where it certainly seems like that kind of competition has failed, because we've ended up with the results are something that is not good for society. It might be good for the cable companies, not good for the consumer, because we've got these sort of monopolies that are separated out by area and don't have to compete with anybody. My question is, what would stop a new company from competing with fiber optic? And I actually remember when I lived in New York, when I moved there, it would have been around like 2006 or so, Verizon Fios was like a big deal. They were rolling out Fios everywhere, which is Verizon's fiber optic service. And I remember I would check their, zip code tool, is it in your area, once every, couple months. Because Time Warner Cable was so bad at the time, and I couldn't upload my web videos for my sketch comedy group, to our FTP site. I was like, I can't upload my dumb 3-minute video. This was, connections were really bad 10 years ago. And then it never came. It never came to my neighborhood. And then I recently looked it up and found out that Fios just sort of stopped expanding, that the program kind of failed. It still exists in the areas where it's available, but they, I don't know, sort of petered out. And so I always wondered what happened. Why is it that, if fiber optics is so amazing, why is there not, some company coming in and laying all that glass all over every city in America?
You have lived the country story there, Adam, I have to say, because there was a CEO of Verizon at the time, Ivan Seidenberg, who understood fiber and thought that it would be great for Verizon to leap ahead, but his shareholders did not agree with him. And here's the difference between a utility, which is what fiber access has to be treated as, and these companies who have very short-term horizons and needs for extraordinary returns across a very short period of time. Verizon announced in March 2010 that it was no longer going to expand its Fios coverage. As it is, it was covering about 10% of American households, if I've got this right. And they've since sold off their Fios systems in California and Texas and Florida because Verizon's retreated to mostly being a wireless media company. That's how they see themselves. That's where they saw higher margins for themselves, and because they have ceded the wired marketplace, by and large, to the local cable monopoly. Wow. We've learned over time that where consolidation is possible, competition is impossible. And so the cable guys took the wired world, essentially, all over America. They're basically a monopoly. They left behind rural areas, 2 phone companies who are offering copper phone service, not fiber. In those rural areas, often the local provider is trying to pull out those wires and itself become a wireless provider with all the consequences of uncertainty and high data caps and all kinds of things for those people, high data charges for those people. So Verizon has retreated from the fiber world and it sees itself mostly as a wireless company at this point, leaving everything really to the cable guys, particularly in urban areas.
And so is it just that the cost of, laying down all of that glass is, there's no incentive for the cable companies to do it because they've already got all their copper in the ground and, plenty of people are happy to, myself included, pay them, $100 or more a month, for what's essentially a necessity. So they have no incentive to upgrade. Right. And then the barrier to entry is too high. I mean, if Verizon can't do it, who's gonna come do it, I guess? Well,
this is why it really is a utility. And I just wrote a big piece about Google Fiber along these lines, that a private company that's looking for really quick returns and sort of quarter-by-quarter results is not going to be happy in the infrastructure business because these are gravel pits. They do pay off a low percentage of return, like 6%, until the sun explodes. You can make money off of them, but they're a utility. They are. It takes a while to make back what it costs to put the fiber in the ground. It may take 10 or 12 years to make that money back. Now, that's fine for local government or state government because they have those long time horizons and they're worried about social justice and economic growth. But it's in no private company's interest to provide that economic growth and social justice for everybody else. It's in their interest to have short-term returns for their shareholders. Right. They really are not in the business of providing basic infrastructure to Americans, and that's where we've screwed up as a country because we don't have a set of policies that will make it easy for cities to build these networks and then lower the cost of capital for them. All of that is being invented on the fly by cities and local areas across the country. And they're doing a great job. You've got to applaud these guys. There are more than 400 areas that are working on or have built fiber networks in their areas.
Well, I'm here talking to Professor Susan Crawford about my favorite subject, the internet. We will be back in just a moment, so stick around.
Ben, we've been accused of so many things over the course of making The Greatest Generation, the Star Trek podcast, that we're a little bit embarrassed to be making.
The embarrassment lies squarely on us, and you can listen anonymously and safely.
Would you like to meet up for some anonymous podcast listening?
This is a podcast you definitely won't want your parents to find on your phone when you pass away suddenly. Discovered by an innocent hotel maid.
They'll make up something else at your funeral. Something more tasteful, like you were listening to Bullseye.
We, of course, have permanently shamed ourselves by making this podcast and putting our real names on it, but you don't have to.
It's a regret we feel several times a week.
Subscribe and delete The Greatest Generation, a Star Trek podcast. Yes, we are actually making a Star Trek podcast.
We should submit that one.
Welcome back to Adam Ruins Everything, the podcast. I am here talking to Harvard University law professor Susan Crawford. So I also understand that part of the problem with the cable companies, as you've said elsewhere, I've read that you've compared New York City's internet speed to places like Istanbul, right?
Yeah. That was several years ago. But it remains true that so I live in New York and in Cambridge. I pay different cable operators a tremendous amount of money for only high-speed internet access. I refuse to get the bundle because I just feel like Americans are being duped and I want to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. And because of that, because I don't get pay TV, they load on a tremendous charge onto my data connection. It's routinely over $100 a month for me in each place to have high-speed internet access.
Wow, really?
Oh, yeah. It's just tremendously expensive. And so when I meet with people from, let's say, South Korea, they'll come over and they'll just look at us in amazement and say, it costs me $30 a month for all the TV I want and data access, and I have a choice of providers. And that's because decades ago, the mayor of Seoul decided it made sense to have this wholesale fiber network running through the subways of that city. And they've got lots of competition, and they can't believe the world that we have here.
And part of the problem also, and that is crazy, by the way, that if all you wanted was high-speed internet, which I think we would both agree is a necessity in 2017 in America, that you'd perhaps have to pay $100 a month for it just for a wired connection. I mean, like maybe it tracks a little bit more when people pay that much for a cell phone bill, but when it's just the one wire that comes to your house, the price is so expensive. But I also know that these cable companies are very bad at bringing the internet to more rural areas, correct?
That's right. There are a lot of parts of the country that cable never touches. So yesterday I was out in rural Minnesota where there are a ton of little towns trying to survive. And boy, it was cold and bleak and dark. These people love where they live, though, and they want to have more generations stay there. They want their kids to stay there. They want to make sure their kids are getting the educations they need. So in this area where I was yesterday, 17 townships and 10 towns joined together to form a cooperative to build a fiber to the farm network. and it's going to be cheap, and it's going to work great, and they're thrilled that they'll be able to retain their quality of life. Cable would never get near those areas. Again, not because they're evil, but because it doesn't fit their business model. The returns will be too slow. They feel they won't be able to charge as much as they'd like.
Right.
And so they're sticking to mostly to urban areas across the country.
Yeah, because the density helps them. If they run one cable and 100 new houses can be connected to it, or 100 new customers, versus way out. I get it. You run one cable out there, and to one farmhouse, and the return on investment isn't as good. But what really strikes me about that is, the first time we spoke, for our pre-interview before we even taped the show, you mentioned the similarity between the cable industry now and electricity. 100 years ago or so. Well, I guess 100 is a bit too much, but the early days of the electrical utility. And that was really stunning to me, because I had just read Robert Caro's biography of LBJ, and he talks about a big early thing that LBJ did as a senator was that, in the early days of the electrical utilities, it was these big companies that said, they electrified the cities, but they had said, oh, we can't electrify the rural areas because they'll never be able to pay enough, and there's not enough customers out there, so there's no way that we can, possibly run the wires. And so as a result, America's farms were just, it was people living the same way they had, and it was, people being deprived of something that wasn't a luxury, but, they were starting to realize was a necessity. You had people, having to, iron their clothes by, heating it up on a stove and stuff like that. These incredible labor-saving devices that they weren't having. And so they basically, this big moment in LBJ's life where he sort of forced these electricity companies to engage in rural electrification in Texas, and that story had stuck with me because today we think of electricity as being essentially almost it is a public utility. There's a company involved, but you don't really think of that company as being a rapacious company that's always raising prices on you. It's more like, oh, well, this is the price I pay for the pipes, and they can't mess with me too much because we have this social contract that everybody knows that everybody needs this to live. Same with water and anything else. And I hadn't realized until you said that how similar the internet feels to that, where it feels like, oh yeah, this is something that we all really need as a utility, but we haven't yet gotten around to ensuring that everyone will have access to it, and maybe we need to go through the same process that we went through with electricity.
Adam, I'm so touched that you pointed to that moment in the Caro book. Robert Caro has said he wants to be remembered for those passages that describe how grim and difficult life was in the hill country around Austin without electricity. And the people there named their children for LBJ after he brought it to them. That's how dramatic it is. And the parallel is exact. We are one nation. We need to give opportunity to every child, not just the ones living in urban areas. We need to make sure everybody has access and opportunity for health care. That's where we are with this fiber question. And again, we need to discuss among ourselves, what do you mean how it's too expensive? It's too expensive for the quarterly returns of a particular private company. It's not too expensive for the nation, for a state, for a local government, who is patient and can wait for their capital to pay back. Because the spillovers, what happens to society as a result of having this infrastructure in place are just stupendous. And I'll say, you remember from those Caro descriptions how sad life was before electricity? Well, yesterday, in rural Minnesota, 2 grown men cried in front of me about the difficulty of their lives without new businesses, and that would only come with great internet access to their area. So this is just as grim for them. And I think it's important to note that every house in America is rated for a certain amount of electricity that's required to come into that house for it to be livable, essentially. We need to do the same thing with fiber optic. If you don't have a terrific glass connection to your home or business, it shouldn't be permitted as a place. We should make sure that everybody gets this basic level. It's just a question of what's basic for opportunity and hope for America.
So that's such a powerful vision, and it's so clearly something that we should, endeavor to do nationally, is to bring the internet and bring data to everyone in the country. But what strikes me is that a lot of the same politicians who I expect have the attitude of no, let's let the cable companies do whatever they want, let's be very, very hands off, are the same folks representing the rural districts, at least to some extent. The sort of like liberal coastal areas, who are maybe a little bit more quick to use government regulation to solve this issue, are the ones that have the better internet in the country. And so it's a little bit surprising to me that the natural constituency for expanding internet access hasn't caused more movement in Washington around this issue.
Yeah, it's not surprising to me because we have a big educational task to carry out. Look at the state of Massachusetts. Western Massachusetts is an internet access desert. It's awful. But the people in eastern Massachusetts say, well, look, we have cable. Oh, isn't that good enough for you? Why would you leapfrog us and go into fiber? That seems to be their attitude. And so even on the coasts, there's not enough imagination or, frankly, knowledge about what's possible and what's permissive, what's required for the entire country. What I'm noticing is that in these rural areas, it's like a drumbeat of anxiety about the need for fiber everywhere. And in fact, at least local legislators are definitely getting the picture. This is shifting, Adam. I think more and more awareness is coming to Americans as they realize just how essential fiber access is.
And do you think it's something that can only be provided by the government, or at least the government has to take a strong hand in, or is it the kind of thing you can solve with a hybrid approach? Or
well, I think it'll only happen. We'll only get this basic service to all Americans with genuine policy by government. We've seen the private market at work here, and our telephone network was the envy of the world when it was put in place, but that was only possible because of government engagement in telephone. We need now the same moment. We've grown up since the era of the telephone, but the economics remain the same. It's expensive to put in these networks. We have these wildly disparate geographies between rural and urban. We've got to balance out who pays how much, in each one of those areas, and make sure that everybody gets treated fairly. There's a lot to be worked out, and that's only done with the involvement of government, because only government has that long-term view in mind. Look, I'm not talking about government regulating the internet. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about government ensuring that every American has terrific internet access at a reasonable price. And that only happens with the engagement of leadership. I hope someday we'll have a president who understands this issue as FDR understood electrification. And at the moment, engagement by local government to at least make sure their communities are taken care of.
Right. It's so interesting that you mentioned the telephone company too, or the telephone system, because the telephone network was for most of the time a total monopoly, right? But it served the American people very well because of, I suppose, a limited amount of government regulation. Like, my understanding is the entire idea of net neutrality and the debate over that is essentially descended from the policy that we had put in place for the telephone, that despite the fact that AT&T owned the wires, they couldn't tell you what you could say over the phone. They had to treat all traffic equally, no matter who it was between. As much as the policy of net neutrality is cast by some as sort of like government meddling, it was really the exact same policy that we had in place for the telephone. Am I correct?
I think the simplest way to think about this is that, yes, we've always relied on private providers to bring us basic communications, first the telephone and now internet access. But we've also always burdened those private providers, in the past anyway, with obligations to serve everybody at a reasonable price, to not discriminate against particular communications. And the whole picture has not changed. Those same kinds of approaches need to be in place for internet access. Because left to its own devices, the market will systematically cherry pick richer areas and provide them with, consolidated monopolistic second-class service, leave out the poor areas and let them just be relegated to some form of state aid, and make money for itself quarter after quarter in a way that is not aligned with the interests of the country in economic growth and social justice. So Yes, this is just a continuation of the way we've always thought about telecommunications. Yes, we love the private providers. We want them to do it, but they have to be burdened with obligations to serve the rest of us. And the way to do that these days is through overseeing the construction of what is, in essence, a public option, fiber conduit or glass itself that's available to lots of actors.
And it does sort of seem that as someone who's been sort of aware of these issues my whole life, or to a certain extent, I don't know. I read the blog Boing Boing. They write about these things. I know a little bit. It seemed like we were starting to make some progress. That Tom Wheeler's FCC was, sort of getting the memo in a strong way. I remember being so struck by the fight over net neutrality in 2015 that. When I think there were some proposals that were sort of anti-net neutrality and people. There was sort of like an internet-wide campaign over it. John Oliver did his segment, which got a lot of attention. I made a video of College Humor, which did not nearly as big an impact as John Oliver, but we tried to do our bit. And then they came around, and my understanding is reclassified broadband providers as being akin to a telephone network, correct?
That's the big move that Tom Wheeler made in February 2015 in response to those 4 million comments from around the country and in response to the reality that we have a broken market for internet access in the country. He said, we're going to treat high-speed internet access as a utility. He didn't put in place a whole lot of rules about that. He left that for later days. But that was the signal move, and that was what was needed. So the question is now what's going to happen in the next 4 years, and it's pretty clear that Ajit Pai, the new FCC chairman, will want to undo absolutely everything and basically let these guys merge and do whatever they want. And by these guys, I mean AT&T, Verizon, Charter, and Comcast. So that's why, because human beings are resilient by nature, I'm turning to cities and communities and places around the country that are thinking this through for themselves, looking to control their own destiny, understanding that they have agency and autonomy and are not stuck with what the private market has chosen to provide them of its own grace.
Is there I have to ask, speaking of Ajit Pai and that effort, is there a case to be made for that point of view? In your view, is it is there a philosophical difference of that you can give credit to of they have this theory that works this way and we can see whether or not it works, or is it just sort of an example of regulatory capture where the cable companies are sort of calling the shots here? I'm always unsure how to view it.
Well, you have to view people as having positive intent, and Pai is a smart guy. He would define the market for high-speed internet access extremely broadly. He'd say, look, if you've got a cellular plan, that's a form of it. If you've got a cable connection, that's a form of it. You've got DSL over copper line, that's a form of it. And we have a wildly competitive market because all of these things are out there battling with each other. We don't need regulation. That's his philosophical viewpoint. I would say no when it comes to both the country's need for world-class high-speed internet access and the reality of wired connections in the United States. We don't have a functioning market at all, and we've got stagnant, places across the country that suffer with very high prices or no service at all, and government needs to be active. So we have two different definitions of what the thing is that's the problem. And he would say, tons of competition, things are great, look at my phone, isn't it terrific? And I would say, no, we're laboring in the dark ages, and we've really got to work harder as a country to fix this situation.
Do you have any predictions or that are more specific about like how what exactly the new FCC will try to do, or what they'll be able to accomplish, or any response that you hope there might be from the public, or et cetera?
Well, actually, the new FCC has only to just sit by and let things go through, like the AT&T Time Warner merger right now, or state laws aimed at keeping cities from building these networks. It just has to let those slide by. And it can wait for Congress to do the job of writing a new Telecommunications Act. That'll be a mosh pit of special interests. It'll take quite a while in order to undo the reclassification decision you and I just talked about a moment ago. So in essence, all Pai has to do is just sit and not enforce anything. And in the meantime, there will be tons of lobbying by the big companies at the state level to keep cities from doing anything, and efforts to keep the status quo in place by them in marketplaces across the country. So what you can do as an individual is give your mayor air cover, political air cover, encouragement to consider, as San Francisco is doing, having a street grid of fiber in place. Educate yourself about the issues, get involved with your local university or others who are really working hard on this issue, and just keep pushing ahead, particularly in communities, to make sure you and your neighbors control your own destiny and you're not subject to the whims of these companies.
Because, this is a field in which I've always been struck by, as we talk about at the end of our episode, how much people raising their voices has made a difference in terms of internet activism. There's been quite a few times where you would think that the topic was too wonky or too down in the details of infrastructure planning for anybody to care, and then these sort of campaigns form around it. And I know we can't rely on that happening every couple months in response to every bill, about the internet, especially when there's so many other things going on in the world. But it seems like people really do care about this issue and can get mobilized about it.
They really do care. And once they understand it, they're mad as hell. And they really get active and they join together. Americans are terrific, and I'm reminded of that on these trips. Every conversation I have is moving and interesting, and they're ready to fight for this. They just need to know which direction to go, and that requires understanding that this stuff isn't rocket science. It's all about lowering the barriers to installing fiber, making capital available, giving political cover to the actors who want to do something about it so they don't get destroyed by the incumbents for even talking about government involvement in high-speed internet access. That issue should not be viewed as somehow a Democratic or Republican issue. It's just about quality of life and opportunity for every American. No American should be dumbed down. So it's all about activism towards a purpose, which is overcoming this sense of inevitability that we're in the thrall of these four companies and we can do nothing about it. That's just not true. There are things we can do about it. We just need to direct our energy in the right direction.
That's so wonderful. Well, that would be a great final thought, but I have one more question for you, if I may.
What's that?
I'm so interested in how it became sort of a Republican-Democrat issue because, if you look at the history of it, it wasn't, always the case that, conservatives were opposed to net neutrality or this sort of like regulation of the cable industry. I have in my notes that in 2002, Scalia argued that broadband should have been considered a common carrier, until in 2008, the GOP FCC told Comcast to start discriminating against BitTorrent traffic. Like there's all sorts of examples of in the historical record of people from both sides approaching it as a nonpartisan issue. And there's the fact that a lot of I imagine Republican constituents would want this as well. So what is it that is getting in the way of this being seen as a nonpartisan issue?
Humans are capable of remarkable self-deception. And at the federal level, this has become a partisan issue with Republicans saying, keep your government mitts off my internet, which is absolutely incorrect on so many levels. At the local level, this is a nonpartisan issue. Republican mayors, Democratic mayors, Republican constituents, it doesn't matter. They all understand the need for inexpensive, world-class information access in order to survive in the 21st century economy. So and electrification, by the way, was exactly the same way. My great-grandfather was a rock-ribbed Republican, but he didn't like to see anybody bossed around, either by, in his case, unions, or also companies that were providing private electricity services and controlling markets. He hated that too. So not wanting to be bossed around is neither a Democratic nor Republican emotion. And that's actually what this issue is about. It's just that on the federal level, it's become a bumper sticker about less government something or other, which makes no sense because actually if you just get government involved in making sure the basic wholesale network exists, you need a lot less regulation to monkey with what happens on top of that wholesale facility because competition will emerge on its own. So there you are. This should not necessarily be partisan at all. It's just that Americans at the federal level fool themselves and say, this must have something to do with overregulation, and they're just wrong.
Yeah, I wonder, I often think that there's a fundamental, like, underlying disagreement between Republicans and Democrats on this, on these sorts of issues that isn't ever, totally uncovered, which is that a lot of times it seems as though, in order to have competition in a free market, you sort of need like this substrate, like under the market. You need like a foundation, which I would call infrastructure. In order to ship goods around, you need roads and you need, electricity to make them and things like that. And a lot of times it seems as though, when we're making progress towards, okay, we've got a new fundamental feature of, that we need to establish that is just to have around, make sure everyone has access to it. And, you pay for it, but, mostly you're paying for whatever commerce you're doing on that network. That's where the real market forces are happening. The goal of that sort of regulation is in order to create a freer, better, more healthful market. It's just trying to create the foundation for it, and that should be perhaps or at least that's perhaps the Democratic view. I'm not sure. That should be the role of regulation, is to ensure that playing field.
Exactly. So, Adam, I think the really brief way to capsulize what you've just brilliantly laid out is that the regulatory ideal is that it unleashes human ingenuity. It makes possible the great things that Americans are capable of. And that's what's needed in this context. As fiber becomes a basic utility, got to make sure everybody has it so that all these markets can thrive. It's the background for absolutely everything we want to do in education, healthcare, new services, new inventions, new ways of making a living, more jobs for Americans, a bigger middle class, all of that. And so there is no necessary reason to say that this should be only provided by the private market. We've seen that fail, and we need to oversee that market with real strength in order to ensure that we get to the goals that an American deserves.
All right. Well, I think that feels like the note that I want to end on. So thank you. Unless there's anything else, unless there's any other point you want to make on this topic, I could listen to you talk about internet infrastructure for hours. So anything that you want to say on this point, I'm happy to hear. If there's any other thing you want to get off your chest.
Yeah, infrastructure is sexy stuff, isn't it? It's really great. I have to say that if I had anything left to say, it would be about these trips I've just made to Greensboro, North Carolina, Wilson, North Carolina, Chattanooga, Tennessee, Western Massachusetts, rural California, rural Minnesota, that, the American dream is not dead, and we are not passive creatures waiting for somebody to tell us what to do. We just need to be woken up a bit. And if anything, the Trump election is waking up a ton of people. Yeah. And I hope that will help us reach our dreams the way we really should be able to.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, Susan, and for doing the TV show and, for talking to me about this more in depth. It's a topic that's really been close to my heart for most of my life, and I'm sure now is for most people. And I'm so glad that you're out there, banging your drum and waking people up across the country.
All right. Well, have a great day. Thanks a ton. I really appreciated it being on.
Thank you once again to Susan for coming on the show. I hope you guys love that interview as much as I did. And that is it this week for Adam Ruins Everything, the podcast. We will be back in 2 weeks, so please tune in. In the meantime, if you're looking for another podcast to listen to, may I suggest the podcast Love and Radio. It is produced by a very good friend of mine, Nick Vanderkolk. We actually went to college together, and his podcast is so fascinating. He brings you these incredible spooky stories from around the world, stories that spook but also enlighten. What I really enjoyed from a couple weeks ago was this interview with a man named Daryl Davis who figured out how to disarm the Ku Klux Klan through the power of compassionate and empathetic conversation. It was really, really a cool interview, and I think if you check it out, you're really going to love it. That's called Love and Radio. Or you can just listen to this podcast again in 2 weeks. Up to you. Our producer is Shara Morris. If you like the show, please be sure to tell a friend and subscribe to us on iTunes or your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to leave us a rating or comment wherever you subscribe, because it can help out and bring more people some of this really cool shit information. Again, Adam Ruins Everything is currently in the off season, but we're coming back this summer, and you can find clips and full episodes in the meantime at TrueTV. Write this down. TrueTV.com / not backslash. TrueTV.com, Adam Ruins Everything. You need me to spell it? No, you got it. You know the URL, and you can also find it on the Watch True TV app. Thank you guys so much. Until then, we'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
MaximumFun.org.
Comedy and culture.
Artist owned.
Listener supported.